get up and say some of the things that the previous speaker said. He spoke about choice, and he spoke about grandparents and aunts and uncles raising and helping to raise children. While at the same time, his government has prevented thousands of parents of new Canadians to come into this country to participate in that process of raising children, Mr. Speaker, and imparting the cultures from back home into the next generation, Mr. Speaker. This government is taking choices away from families by not allowing them to be reunited in Canada for that better life, Mr. Speaker. He spoke about how the provincial government in Ontario is facing some financial struggles. But at the same time, it's because that government went and cut health care for refugees that then the provincial government had to pick up the slack. Because as the court said, that was cruel and unusual. And that's what we get from this government, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, every single budget, we find things that are cruel and unusual in it. And now we have this new scheme, these new schemes coming from the government, hell-bent on making sure that the cupboard is bare by the time the election happens, because another government of another sort might want to take a different approach. Now, he talks about being opposed to universality. Now, universality we brought to healthcare, Mr. Speaker, and it transformed the country because at that point, no family had to decide between putting food on the table and bringing a loved one to a hospital or to a doctor to get medical care. And that's what we want to do for childcare. And we want to make sure that no family has to decide between whether or not to work, whether or not, Mr. Speaker, whether or not to work, whether or not to put their child into care, whether or not to feed their family, put a roof on the head, over their heads. But this government is actually taking choices away. Now, we mentioned the fact that this is going to bring back some money into parents' pockets. This is going to help fund childcare. Now, childcare in the province of Ontario, Mr. Speaker, depending on where you go, is going to cost you, on average, between $1,000 and $2,000 a month. So this government's plan, if it does everything they say it does, which it doesn't, will help to pay for health care or child care for kids for 1 to 2 months out of the year. So what are parents supposed to do the rest of the time, Mr. Speaker? They're expanding the Children Fitness Tax Credit. Great if you have the money. But if you are a single parent living in poverty, you already don't have money to put your kids into sports programs, into arts programs. You want to, but you're not able to. And this government, by putting all the money there, takes the choice away from that parent. They're forced not to put their kids into sports, not to put their kids into arts programs, Mr. Speaker. So this government is, in fact, taking choices away. Now, I've sat here for the last 3 years and time again heard government talk and boast, frankly, about the fact that there are 1 million less people on the tax rolls. And if there were 1 million less people on the tax rolls for good reasons, I would applaud them for it, Mr. Speaker. But there are 1 million less people on the tax rolls because they are, in fact, too poor to pay taxes. And instead of focusing on a jobs plan to help get some of these people back to work, or to give them a living wage like the NDP proposed with a $15 minimum wage, they ignore them. They just take them off the tax rolls and leave them to fend for themselves, Mr. Speaker. And that's un-Canadian. We look out for our neighbours. We look out for the less fortunate. We look out for those in need, Mr. Speaker. And that's how you judge a society, by how it treats and takes care of the least fortunate and the most vulnerable. And this government, like some Conservative governments, particularly the Mike Harris government in Ontario, has really shown great disdain for people living in poverty, Mr. Speaker, by cutting their supports and services, by treating them like criminals, Mr. Speaker, and it has no place, and we need to move on from that kind of behavior. Now, Bill C-43 is shown to be yet another anti-democratic omnibus bill that subverts our traditional way of government and completely dismisses the role of this House in providing considered oversight and debate. Now, the bill is, has been said, over 450 pages long, has more than 400 clauses, amends dozens of acts, and contains a variety of measures never mentioned in the budget. Now, in their anti-democratic haste, it's meant that the previous budget bills that have been forced through the House and committees without adequate study, and we lament that the fact that this will likely reoccur again, how are we as parliamentarians, Canadians, and the people of my riding supposed to give considered thought and feedback to such Trojan horse bills that get rammed through the House by this government? And now, of course, Mr. Speaker, many of the measures contained within this bill are fixing the problems created by them ramming through the previous bill and the one before that and the one before that. If this government would actually stop to take the time to do things properly, Mr. Speaker, they wouldn't have to spend so much time fixing problems they themselves have created. And it does certainly seem that they do enjoy creating new problems, much to the contrary of what the parliamentary secretary was just saying a few minutes ago. Now, we're not able to properly study these bills, and of course, the Finance Committee, which I have to say does do very good work for this House, is then overburdened. It's overburdened by the fact that the budget bill comes with so many clauses and amendments and things that have nothing to do with the budget, Mr. Speaker. And that makes the job of the committee chair for finance even more challenging, Mr. Speaker, and he does a very good job. I do have to admit he does a very good job in that committee. But then he has to spend time, like his committee members, dealing with amendments and clauses that have nothing to do with the budget, things that should be going to the Environment Committee, things that should be going to the Industry Committee, things that should be going to the Transportation Committee, things that should go to Agriculture. There are lots of things in the budget that have nothing to do with the budget itself. And it means that we end up, and they end up, wasting a lot of time because of it. And then the government has to come back and fix it again next time. I'm very curious when we get to the spring and there's a new budget and there's an Implementation Act, how many things in that Implementation Act will be put in to fix the problems created with this one, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the government used to lament omnibus bills, but then they got into power, and instead of changing Ottawa as they said they would, Ottawa seems to have changed them. And they've become exactly like the governments that came before them with respect to omnibus bills, and they've taken it, frankly, to a whole new level, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister used to get up and stand when he was Leader of the Opposition and get very angry at the fact that there were Liberal bills that were 80 pages long. 80 pages, Mr. Speaker? This sounds like the good old days, because now we're dealing with omnibus bills that are 400 more pages long, that are 370 more pages than that bill was, Mr. Speaker. But the Prime Minister has no problems with those now. Now, we do have a well-spelled out and reasoned amendment that's being brought forward by my colleague, the member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, in which he states that this House should decline to give second reading to Bill C-43 because it amends dozens of unrelated acts without adequate parliamentary debate and oversight, fails to address persistent unemployment and sluggish economic growth, aims to strip refugee claimants of access to social assistance to meet their basic needs, imposes a poorly designed job credit that will curate few, if any, jobs, while depleting employment insurance funds. And on that point, Mr. Speaker, the parliamentary secretary that spoke before talked about how their government wants to keep people's money in their own pockets. That government, Mr. Speaker, was complicit with the Liberal government before them in raiding the Employment Insurance Fund, the fund and the money owned and contributed by workers and employers of nearly $60 billion, Mr. Speaker. $60 billion that could have gone back to workers. They could have gone into skills development and training. They could have made sure that more than half of the people in Toronto who are unemployed can actually qualify for EI, Mr. Speaker. And they talk about employment and growing jobs. Unemployment in my riding is over 12%, Mr. Speaker. which is a far cry from where it was when this government took power. And I look forward to hearing questions now, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. And my colleague started off by talking about our great announcement yesterday to help families. I've done a few rough calculations, Mr. Speaker, and I'd just like him to respond to this. If a child under the age of 6 roughly gets $2,000 a year in tax credits, over 6 years that would be close to $12,000. And then from the ages of 7 to 17, that's another 10 years at about $720 a year, another $7,200. So we're talking about a child from birth through to the age of 17, helping that family financially with tax credits worth up to $19,000. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. And if you take a family of 2 children, 3 children, we're talking about the government helping that family by close to $60,000 for 3 children. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm the father of 5 children, and when I was raising my young children, all I got from the government at that time, which was Liberal, was higher taxes. And I'm almost convinced that what I would get if we had an NDP government would be even higher taxes. So I'd like to know how the member could possibly put down a government helping a family with 3 children by close to $60,000. And, Mr. Speaker, 2/3 of Canadian families will benefit from the measures that we announced yesterday. So I don't want him to say it's just going to benefit the rich, because that is absolutely false. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member Scarborough Southwest.
That's perfectly fine. I don't need to say that. Now, the member just laid it out himself when he was talking about the amount of money that would come back to a family and to children up to the age of 6. Now, I did some rough calculations there, and just based on the numbers that the member himself used, it would take 6 years of what they are prepared to give to parents to pay for 1 year of childcare in Ontario. So what about the next 5 years? Where are they going to find the money to help them with childcare there? That's where the NDP's universality in childcare will actually help to provide the money to pay for childcare through that child's entire years on earth, growing up to the age of 6 when they go to school.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to the member is what is one of the nature of the budget itself being very lengthy. He made reference to that. We have numerous pieces of legislation, some of which, Mr. Speaker, could have been standalone pieces of legislation, introduced by separate ministers, having more debate inside the chamber. And they've kind of snuck it in through a budget bill. Then we have time allocation that's been put on to this particular bill, which will again prevent really the opportunity to have more dialogue. And then we have committees that are no longer meeting, Mr. Speaker, because the official NDP are not allowing them to meet. My question is to the members: to what degree does he believe that members are losing the opportunity to ultimately hold government more accountable when we see measures of this nature being taken?
The Honourable Member Scarborough Southwest.
Well, I mean, members of this House definitely lose the ability to address the issues that matter to Canadians and deal with these budgets in the proper way when they're introduced through omnibus legislation. However, I'd like to just quickly point out to the member that committees just require the committee chair to call a meeting, Mr. Speaker. So if they're not having meetings, maybe the member should ask the Conservative committee chairs why not.
Questions and comments? Honourable for Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Toronto for his very good speech. And, we've seen the Conservatives come out with a wasteful and ineffective income splitting program that will benefit only the most wealthy 15% of Canadians, and they'll try to spin it that that's not what their income splitting program is, but anyone who examines it will know that. Can the member describe the benefit of having a universal childcare program? I know people in my area are paying thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars every year to get good quality care for their kids if they can find it. The NDP will fix that. Can he describe how?
Excellent. The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, and I thank my colleague for the question. I actually spent the first 5 years of my working life in childcare, Mr. Speaker, in a daycare, teaching kids how to count to 10, how to write their names, Mr. Speaker, and it's a very rewarding endeavor. However, people aren't paid very well in it either. And the NDP's plan would create up to 1 million new childcare spaces, Mr. Speaker, so that parents actually have the choice whether to put their children into care or to take care of them at home, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to say that governing is about choices. Now, this government calls us tax and spenders, Mr. Speaker, but their plans to spend money in this reckless fashion, Mr. Speaker, makes them tax and wasters. They tax Canadians, and then they waste the money on the people that need it the least.
Resuming debate.